Okay, so here I have four of your basic soils you'll find at any big box store. I wanted to show everybody visually compare the four basic types of soil you can buy and show the difference between how these look and feel. So on the left here I have topsoil, then we have raised bed soil, potting mix, and then your seed starting mix. And eventually I'm going to do, in this video, I'm going to do an experiment planting seeds in all of these and then comparing how they do in terms of plant growth and so forth. Let's take a look at the topsoil. So right away, now I have just about the same amount in all of these. This is the heaviest, which tells me that it's going to be the most dense. And this is, some basics about the topsoil. This comes right out of the ground as topsoil. There's some particles in it. There's some sand in it. If you feel it, it's a little bit gritty. It's not light. I wouldn't. There's not going to be a lot of drainage in the topsoil. So what do you use this for? You're not going to use this for growing seeds, although we're going to try it. You're going to use this basically for bulk. If you want to, build up your garden bed or your raised bed garden, you would use some of this in addition to other things to sort of add volume and bulk to your garden. But we're going to use it nevertheless and see what happens. Again, it's very heavy. There's a lot of sand in it. I don't know if that shows up on camera. But this is by far the cheapest stuff. Let's go next to the raised bed soil. And by the way, that topsoil is just topsoil. There's no fertilizer in it or anything like that. The next here we have the raised bed soil. Now this is a mixture of a few things. You can see some larger particles in it. This is a little bit lighter than the topsoil. I have tested this and it does drain a little bit better. This does contain some fertilizer in it. So in this case, there's chicken manure in here. And if you, sort of put your hands through it, you can feel these little clumps. That's gonna just give some fertilizer to your garden bed. But for the most part, it's not radically different from the topsoil, but it's gonna offer more drainage for sure. So if you wanted to really bulk up your garden, you might do a combination of this and the topsoil, or if you want to spend the money, just go all topsoil. It really depends what your purposes are. Neither of these are meant for seed starting, but again, we're going to try it out. Okay, next we have the potting mix, and as the name suggests, it's made for pots. This by far so it's much, much lighter than those other two, which tells me there's a lot of porosity in it, which means there's a lot of air gaps and air bubbles inside this soil. Again, it's a mixture of things, so there is some soil in here, some earth, as well as you can see here some bark and some larger particles. You can see the little white rocks. I think this is for drainage, and I believe there might be some peat in here as well to help moisture retention and so forth. This is not made for seed starting, although as you'll see in the experiment, it works rather well. And you can find this in any big box store. Actually, you can find any of these in big box stores. And there's not much else to say about it. It's light, it's fluffy. It comes out of the bag moist, but I did add some water to it and let it dry. So this is, a good consistency for planting the way it looks right now. All right, and let's go to the last one, the seed starting mix. So this comes dry. You have to add water to it. But this is just like, it's like a sponge. You can squeeze it, and there's actually no actual soil in here. It's a mixture of peat moss and coconut coir and one or two other things. Out of all the soils here, the topsoil and the seed starting mix have no fertilizer at all. So whereas the topsoil might have some nutrients in it naturally from organisms living in the topsoil, as far as I know, there are no nutrients at all in this. There's no fertilizer and no nutrients. So as you'll see in the experiment, this does very well in terms of structure because it's so light, so fluffy compared to those other three. But since there's no nutrients in it, you're going to want to add fertilizer to this. Otherwise, once the plants get to a certain size, they'll just die or they'll stop growing. So some properties of this, it holds moisture very well. It also drains very well, so it's perfect. It's very light and fluffy, so it allows the roots to grow very freely without any obstructions. If you compare that to, say, the potting mix, you can see larger particles in here. If a root comes in contact with a large particle like this, it obviously can't go through it. So not as ideal as the seed starting mix. So that's some basic differences. My hypothesis for the experiment is that the potting mix and the seed starting mix are going to do the best. I've decided I'm not going to add any fertilizer to the seed starting mix because I want to see how far it can go or how well it does until it needs fertilizer, as sort of a science experiment. I have grown before in potting mix and it's worked just fine, so we'll see how these two do. In terms of these two, I have no idea. Maybe we'll be surprised. Maybe the topsoil will do really well. Maybe the raised bed soil will, it should do well. I mean, it looks like it's got some decent drainage to it. But again, it's much, much heavier than the potting mix, and I put equal amounts in here. So let's see how these do. I'm going to come back and let's pot the seed trays. Okay, so I planted all the different soils in the different seed trays, and this is the result after 1 week. The potting mix and the seed starting mix are virtually identical. So I overseeded these and I culled them. And the biggest difference between these two and these two is the size. So first of all, the size is different. So this is actually 7 days after I planted them. The size is the biggest difference. The seed starting mix and the potting soil, they both have really beautiful green leaves. They're big. They're a little leggier than I'd like. I'm growing these indoor to sort of control the conditions. So I probably could have given these a little bit more light, but I think they look beautiful and healthy. There's not a huge difference. They're all growing their true leaves, their third leaf, roughly at the same time. Their true leaves are all looking about the same size. I mean, it's possible to even make the argument that the potting soil is doing a little bit better than this in terms of the true leaves, but I would say it's almost a dead heat. But let's look at these other two soils. These are also doing really well. So I would say the potting mix, this is the raised bed mix, this red one. It's doing slightly better than the topsoil. The seedlings are a little bigger, the leaves are bigger. These are already getting a couple true leaves, not nearly as big as the other two, but slightly bigger than the topsoil. The seedlings are definitely healthy. They're green, they're standing up, they look really happy. They're just not as big as the others. So far, conclusions I can make is that the potting mix and the seed starting mix are virtually identical. So I'm going to come back in a week and see how these look after 1 more week, which will be 2 weeks total, and see if there's any change. So let's go take a look. Okay, so here we are 2 weeks later, and there's some obvious differences between the different types of soil. So let me just spread these out a little bit and remind you guys what I planted here. So let's start with the obvious differences here. There are some that are better than others for growing seeds. The clear loser here is topsoil. Now these sprouted and germinated just as fast as the other three. In fact, there was actually no difference between the three within 2 days of them germinating and sprouting. They all looked about the same. And then these sprouted up, and then you can see here not much happened. These seedlings, these first 2 leaves started to sort of die and turn yellow eventually, and there's just not a lot of activity on these. These are basically just going to die. Next we have, so topsoil is no good. Next is the raised bed soil. Now there is some promise to the raised bed soil. You can see that they've all grown, actually all of these cells have grown their true leaves by now. The true leaves look healthy. They look actually really green. The first 2 initial leaves are turning a little bit, I think they've just reached the age where they're starting to die. But the true leaves are actually looking really healthy. Like you can see this one looks great. There's not much else to say because you see the differences between these and those two. So if you had to use raised bed soil and that's all you have, it is possible. Okay, so let's look at the potting soil here. The obvious difference between the potting soil and the seed starting soil, these two, is that these have grown much bigger, and there's probably a reason for that. So let's go over the obvious difference of size. The potting soil that I bought at the store, and most potting soils have this, it has added fertilizer. There is some nitrogen, I think, added to this one. I have to double check what it actually was, but there was some fertilizer added to this. And you can see that's probably a reason why it's growing bigger than these others. The discoloration of some of the leaves, I think, is probably because of the fertilizer. These all receive the same amount of light because they've been growing indoors. But some of these actually, I mean, this one looks fantastic, nice and green. There's a little bit of discoloration at the top. This one looks really healthy. They all look really healthy. It's just some of these bigger leaves are a little bit yellow, and I think that's because of maybe the potting soil might have a little bit too much fertilizer for this size of plant. And then let's look at the seed starting soil. Now these are a little smaller obviously than the potting soil mix, but the leaves are beautiful. They're nice and thick, very green. I haven't added any fertilizer to anything other than what it might have came with. So I know the potting soil came with a little fertilizer, and I believe the raised bed soil also came with a little fertilizer. Seed starting mix does not have any fertilizer in it. So I could have added some at this point, or actually I could have added it probably a week ago, 5 days ago, and it would have been just this size, if not even bigger, who knows. But you can see the leaves look really beautiful, nicely developed, real thick. You can see, again, these are bok choy, so you can see the initial sort of green and white stems coming up, nice contrast of colors. And they look great. Hey gardeners, we're just past the 3-week mark on the seed soil test, and there's some interesting results. So first off, as I'll show you in a second, the topsoil is completely no good, okay? If you're growing with topsoil, it's not gonna, at least for this test, it didn't germinate. It germinated and then it got to the first 2 leaves and then they all died. So this first one is the topsoil. You can see there's not much going on here. It's been like this for 3 weeks now. The only growth I see is on one of these seedlings where there's a true leaf growing, and that's it. Okay, the next one we have here is the raised bed soil, and this has done better, okay? You can see here there's obviously some growth. They're nice and green, but they're very slow. These have been very slow to grow. This will work, I suppose. Maybe if I added some fertilizer to it or something like that, these would have got a little bigger. But for right now, they're very slow. But in terms of growth, I mean, in terms of how they look and the color and the health of the leaves, they look fine. But just like with the topsoil, this is something that you would want to, plant your seedlings in after they've already grown. You don't want to actually plant the seedlings in these. Actually, let's skip ahead to the seed starting soil. So these look great, and until recently they were looking better, but I don't know if you can see this. I'll do a close-up, but the leaves started to turn a little purple, and I think this is because I've added no fertilizer to this at all, and they were bright green, actually dark green, greener than the other one here, until the last week or so, and then they started to have this little purplish color. And let's take a look at the winner here. Okay. So there's an obvious winner here. This is 3 weeks, actually just about 3 weeks for the bok choy. All these are bok choy, and this soil is the potting mix. So the potting mix is the clear winner here. I would say, very obviously, just visually. So the growth has been amazing on these. It was actually the fastest to grow. In the very beginning, this and the seed starting soil were just kind of neck and neck. This was always a little bit better. And then as soon as they started growing true leaves, this thing just exploded. Okay, so now that we know what the winner is, let's take a look at the internal structure of these things and see how the roots developed. So let's start with the topsoil. Again, this is going to be tough to get out. I'm going to do my best here. Yeah, they just fall apart. Okay. Okay, that's the topsoil. We'll go over that in a second. Let's look at the raised bed soil here. I'll take the strongest one. Let's go with this one. Okay, it's a little bit better. And this is the potting mix. I'll just grab this N1. Let's take this guy. A bit tangled with the others, the leaves. Okay. That's the potting mix next to that one. And then the last one is the seed starting tray, which should just come out pretty easily. Let's see here. Yep, there we go. Okay. So as you guys can see, let me just take this in a little bit. We have the topsoil on the left, raised bed soil second, and third here we have the potting mix, and then the fourth one is the seed starting mix. Starting with the raised bed soil, okay, these didn't grow at all. They grew for the first week, about the same as everything else, and then just didn't grow from there. They are in really bad shape. They basically just died. This doesn't have enough drainage. The topsoil, it becomes almost like mud. If this is actually dried over a few days, it becomes a little bit like mud. The roots have no opportunity to actually get any oxygen or air. So I'm suspecting some root rot here. It's hard to see, but as you can see here, that's the extent of the roots. So the topsoil was just, as we expected, not very good at all. Okay, the next here is the raised bed soil. Now this is very heavy and very soft and squishy at the bottom. You can't see it too well, I don't think, on camera, but this is, I can feel some root rot here. These aren't dry, healthy roots that are moist. It's almost like a swampy down here at the bottom. There is some root growth. Now, if this dried out, it might have a chance. But again, just like with the topsoil, the raised bed soil, there's just not enough drainage in it. And you're not going to get enough oxygen down into those roots in order for these roots to grow. So it did kind of work, but then again, it's so soggy and it's a mess. So these two are no good. Now the biggest of these is the potting mix soil, and these look great. Nice and moist but dry. These roots look very healthy, nicely distributed. They look great. And then the last one here is the seed starting mix. Now you can sort of compare the two. This one had more soil in it than this one. If I pull, let's pull another one out just for comparison. Maybe one with a little bit more soil in it. So put this one back. Okay, after looking at this footage, I realized I made a mistake. The potting mix doesn't have less soil than the seed starting mix. What happened was, when you add water to these different mixes, some compress and some don't. So the potting mix actually compressed and became more dense, whereas the seed starting mix, when you add water to it, it tends to actually expand. So that explains why one looks smaller than the other. But you can see, some slight differences. There's actually more root growth, it looks like, with the seed starting mix, but the plants are way smaller. Okay, two things. One, these need fertilizer, as I said before. And second, these actually do really well with root growth. Because if you look at the difference, the roots are so much more numerous in this one than this one. And yeah, they look great. They both look healthy, but this one really has some impressive root growth. Other than that, and you can't see this on camera, but this is much heavier. I know there's more soil to it, but even, sort of mentally knowing that, because this plant's bigger too, this is heavier. The water retention, moisture retention with the seed starting soil is very good, but at the same time, they do hold water. So you don't want to water these too much, because the ability, I could squeeze this right now and it would just be like a sponge and water would just drip out. Not so much with these. This is pretty, it just feels moist. I water these the same amount. It just feels moist. There's much more drainage in the potting mix than there is in the seed starting mix. So whatever one you're using out of these two, the seed starting mix versus the potting mix, you want to adjust your watering accordingly, because if you water the seed starting mix just as much as you would the potting mix, you're going to end up overwatering these. The basic rule of thumb that I use that always works is if these look a little wilty, if they look a little limp, give them water. But until then, don't give them water. That's my rule of thumb. It's always worked. So you can see these, these could probably get a little water. Probably by tomorrow, they'll be a little wilty. I'll give them water then. But other than that, you can see the root growth. So lessons learned here. Potting mix works great. Seed starting mix works great as long as you use fertilizer. Topsoil is a no-go. And raised bed soil is also a no-go for seed starting. Now, we could probably amend this with some drainage. It would need some sort of drainage to work. But as it is, it's just a mess. So thanks for watching.